Hello, and welcome back to the series on a self-worth-driven education. My name is Arun Dureraj, and in this episode, we're going to talk about how teachers can act as guides to their students. When we think about a guide, what are the thoughts that come to our mind? A guide knows the plan. A guide knows the map that will get us to our destination. A guide knows the terrain and the obstacles that can come up along the way. A guide knows even ourselves and our own limitations. A guide knows how to prepare us for the journey. And then finally, a guide knows what pace we need to keep. For teachers to act as guides, these characteristics of guides need to find their way into the student-teacher relationship. Teachers look beyond just the textbooks. If the textbook is a terrain, then the teacher is seeing the terrain from a holistic perspective with the student in mind. Teachers are the ones that find alternative strategies when the normal strategy isn't working. Teachers find ways to problem solve or resolve conflicts along the journey. And finally, teachers set limits or boundaries. In other words, they make sure that we stay on the path. So the ideas of a teacher as a guide encompasses all these things. But when it comes to a self-worth-driven education, there's a little bit more involved. For a teacher to act as a guide, the first step is for the student to choose the track. Now, I have a separate episode on how we can empower students to choose their own path. I want to talk about one strategy called InquiryBased Learning. And keep in mind that the same line of thought can apply to any strategy in which the teacher attempts to act as the guide. Now, in InquiryBased Learning, the teacher's role as guide falls on a spectrum. On the one end, the teacher acts as an expedition educator. On the other end, the teacher acts as the tour leader. It's not that one side of the spectrum is the self-worth side or the good side or the proper side. Actually, self-worth can be incorporated no matter where you are on the spectrum. Let's consider the 4 stages of learning in inquiry-based learning. The first is orientation. This is where students explore their own understanding. The second is hypothesis. Where are the questions that are going to be answered? Third, the investigation, the actual exploring of the content. And then finally, analysis and interpretation. Inquiry-based learning allows for students to take control of one or more of these steps. Depending on which stage you let the student take control, that's where you'll fall on that spectrum. What we need to understand is how to incorporate self-worth in each of these steps. The key to incorporating self-worth is a belief in 2 fundamental principles. First, the students want to develop themselves. They actually want this. And the second is students want to explore. They have a natural instinct and curiosity to explore content. Self-worth states this because by combining the 2 motives, students are subconsciously progressing towards the potential which they all possess but have not yet realized. And that's the essence of self-worth. So let's consider each step and see how we can bring about these 2 principles of self-worth. In the orientation step, students collect background information. In this process, we need to incorporate every student's contribution. So when we're looking at background data, background knowledge, background best practices, sometimes the tendency is to choose the students who have success in the class. But self-worth states that everyone can contribute. We just don't realize how they'll impact the situation. So we need to incorporate every student's contribution. There is no experience or topic which should be ignored. The more we ignore this and pick and choose which inputs to incorporate, the more we are suggesting that some opinions are not as important as others. And this is definitely against self-worth. In fact, the challenge is that as teachers, we have our own agenda. And trying to integrate a teacher's agenda with all the students' input can be difficult and often requires creativity. One approach could be to group the ideas and thoughts. Then students will feel that their input is represented by a group. It's not really an ideal choice because by grouping, we're sort of minimizing the impact of each individual input. But it's a partially adequate response to this problem, especially when you've got large groups of students. Possibly a better approach could be divide the large group into smaller groups and allow each group to have a parallel inquiry expedition. What we need to avoid is picking the same students over and over again. In the hypothesis step of inquiry-based learning, we need to consider all those ideas that were conveyed, and a question needs to form. Now the trick to this is never pick just one question that's presented from a single student. Allow the question to evolve, allow the students to shape the question to combine as many inputs as possible. In the third phase, we come to the planning and the investigation. This is where the kids actually do the work. There's an interesting irony here. Students actually need to work in groups to maximize the benefit of this step. However, groups can often be the bane of classrooms, in that the more capable students end up doing the bulk of the work, and the less capable tend to piggyback on the efforts of the others. However, there can be a simple solution. Allow for each step in the investigation to be owned by a student. Most investigations are a process, and each step in that can be taken by a different student. This includes, and this is key here, this includes a student presentation of their work, their step in the process, and a celebration of that work by their peers. This is the self-worth step. This is where we showcase each student's contribution. And if we don't showcase the student's presentation of their step in the process, as teachers, we're not helping those individuals discover their self-worth. Contribution is critical to realizing self-worth through groups. Without feeling that we contributed, we don't really get a taste of that potential that's within us. And coming to the fourth and final step in inquiry-based learning, the analysis and the interpretation, here the collaborative investigation comes together and forms a result. This, unfortunately, does tend to reduce the number of contributions that individuals can make, which is why in inquiry-based learning, as well as in many other methods of learning, this actually takes a back seat. It's not about the students getting to a final goal which the teacher wanted them to get to. It's about that process. In other words, the previous step, the planning and investigation, that needs to be highlighted, that needs to be celebrated. And the analysis and interpretation is just the end of the trek, but it's the journey that's important. If we consider these 4 steps of inquiry-based learning and apply the idea that students want to explore and they want to improve themselves, we can see how each step in inquiry-based learning can be adapted to include self-worth, to include the idea that students are on a journey to also discover their self-worth and not just the objectives of the content. And as I said before, inquiry-based learning is just one approach to allowing a teacher to be a guide. There are many approaches, but each of them must include the principles of self-worth in order for it to be a journey in which students discover their own self-worth.